Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. As is our wont in times of maximum asininity and rank punditry, we like to counter-program from time to time and talk about things that matter that you can actually discuss reasonably. And one of my favorite people to do that sort of thing is Ken Pollack, my colleague at the American Enterprise Institute. He's a senior fellow there, specializing in foreign policy, Middle East, Iran. He's an Iran expert. He's written some excellent books on Iran. We'll put all that stuff in the show notes. He's had some affiliation with some three-letter agencies, and he would never want his generals to be like Hitler's generals. So with that, Ken Pollack, welcome back to the Remnant.
Thank you so much for having me back, Jonah. It's always a pleasure to be on the Remnant.
So why don't we start? You have a piece in Foreign Affairs about how this isn't so much the concerns about a war between Iran and Israel kind of missed the point. It's that there already is one, and the question is how bad will it get? So why don't we just sort of start there? How bad will it get?
Sure. So I think this is a really interesting, important question, given all the rank punditry that we see around it right now. The reason I wrote the piece is Foreign Affairs came to me and said, hey, everybody is talking about an all-out war between Israel and Iran. Tell us what that would look like. And I thought this was a great piece to write because my perspective as an old Middle East military analyst who's written any number of books, and as you pointed out, used to do it for the U.S. government, is it's not going to get nearly as bad as people seem to think. Right, this constant drumbeat of escalation to an all-out war. I mean, again, as you just pointed out, and as I pointed out in the Foreign Affairs piece, we've already got a war between Iran and Israel going on. And the truth of the matter is, it probably isn't going to get much worse than this, because the simple fact is that neither country has the ability to do that much damage to each other. Now, I'm going to set aside here for the moment Israel's strategic arsenal. There is no question that Israel has probably a wide range of weapons of mass destruction that it could employ against Iran if it chose to do so. I think the likelihood of them doing so is basically zero. Right? This war is not going to get to that point, not under any set of circumstances, largely because Iran's ability to do damage to Israel is incredibly small. Right? And the problems here are, first and foremost, distance. The countries are too far apart. At their closest point, they're 750 miles. The distance between central Israel and Tehran and Esfahan, the major cities of Iran, is about 1,000 miles. Israel has obviously a relatively small, but superb, absolutely exquisite air force that can certainly do some incredible things, but it doesn't have a massive air force, right? It can't level entire Iranian cities. And Iran has a smaller air force that is utterly incompetent, that probably couldn't do any damage to Israel whatsoever. The one asset that it has, or set of assets that it has to strike at Israel directly, is what we've seen. It's its ballistic missiles, its cruise missiles, its drones. And we've now seen them try to employ that twice. On April 13th and on October 1st, they fired 500 missiles, cruise missiles, and drones at Israel, and they've done effectively no damage, right? And that is likely to obtain in the future. So Iran is a very big country with an incredibly weak military that has almost no capacity to project power against Israel. Israel is a very potent military, but it too is small. And, it can do some really remarkable things against Iran, but those are going to have to be small. And what I tried to point out in the piece is that even for the Israelis, there are just a whole bunch of issues that are going to make it tough for the Israelis to mount repeated strikes against Iran. So this all-out war that people seem to imagine, with armies moving back on both sides, that's not going to happen. There are too much distance and too many countries in between them for that to happen. I think people seem to envision something like the bomber campaigns of the Second World War, or Vietnam, or even what the U.S. did against Iraq and Serbia, right? Neither side has the capacity to do that. And so if things were to escalate, and again, I shudder to use that word because seems to trigger images in people's minds that I think are wildly out of whack with the actual military capabilities on both sides. Right? The escalation will probably be toward more of what we've already seen. The Iranians will lob missiles at Israel from time to time. They'll try to do it in more clever ways. They clearly are getting some help from the Russians, who are trying to help them make those missiles penetrate a bit better. But the Iranians don't have a limitless supply. They've probably got maybe high hundreds or low thousands of them. So they've already fired 500. Right? They can't just keep doing this forever. And again, Israel has an ability to mount a variety of different small strikes on Iran that'll be very painful for them, but they're not going to be devastating, right? They're not going to burn Tehran to the ground. It's not going to look anything like, London during the Blitz, or Berlin after World War II, or Hanoi, or, even Baghdad during the Gulf War, right? And so we have to recognize that the potential for escalation here is much, much more limited than what people think, because of the limited military capabilities on the two sides.
Okay, so somewhere between pushback and follow-up question. If you had said to me 8 weeks ago, 7 weeks ago, basically made the case that a war, all-out war between Iran and Israel would be remarkably limited compared to the images that people are conjuring of what that would look like, I would say, well, wait a second. You say there's no land, there's no troops going in or anything like 7-8 weeks ago. The whole point of Hezbollah, right on the northern border of Israel, was that they had been blooded in Syria. They were a much more serious fighting force. This is what we were told, right? And they were right on top of Israel in the north. Hamas, already degraded, 8 weeks ago, but was certainly a year and a half ago seen as the sort of axis of resistance thing, where essentially Iran had, in effect, proxy ground troops stationed to the north and south of Israel. If, let's say, on October 6, 2023, Iran decided to truly launch an all-out war, right? If they were all in with Hezbollah, all in with Hamas, and we're going to mobilize their military assets as well, maybe throw in some Houthis for giggles. Wouldn't that all-out war actually look like much more like an all-out war of the kind that you're saying can't happen?
Yeah, no. So this, I think, is an interesting question, and it's a different question, right? Because
Right,
you're
sure,
right.
sure.
That was the great danger. And if Iran had been responsible for coordinating the events of October 7, 2023, I think that in an ideal world, that's what they would have tried to do. They would have hit Israel simultaneously. Hamas, Hezbollah, their own efforts, the Iraqi Hashd-e-Shabi militias, maybe the Houthis thrown in, right? A much bigger attack on Israel from all sides. That's not what happened. We're now starting to learn more about exactly how this worked. And it does seem that while Iran was providing Hamas a lot of support, they didn't know the exact timing. They weren't aware of exactly what Hamas was trying to do when they did it. But yes, there's no question that would have been a much bigger problem for Israel. They didn't do that. And so, what we've seen over the course of the past year plus is that Israel has now been able to wage these wars sequentially, which is exactly what they wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, I had another piece in Foreign Affairs right after the October 7th attack saying, once again, people are wildly exaggerating the potential for escalation here. The Israelis want to focus on Hamas. That's going to be a very big operation of theirs. It's going to take months. They're going to, Hezbollah attacked them. They're going to try to deal with Hezbollah as best they can, minimizing the amount of forces that they have to divert to deal with Hezbollah, because they want to concentrate on Hamas. And I said in that piece, the real question mark is that once they have done to Hamas whatever it is that they plan to do to Hamas, the big question mark is going to be, at that time, do they then decide that they're going to go after Hezbollah? And of course, that is exactly what happened. But the war has gone much better for Israel, in part, as you point out, Jonah, because we learned that, and again, I suspected as much at the time, I think others did as well, that the Israelis had learned a tremendous amount about how to fight these kinds of wars over the last 17 years since the Second Lebanon War were going to do better, but also because they were able to wage them sequentially.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And just the last point to make there is, as again you're pointing out, Hezbollah was the biggest problem for Israel by far because of its proximity, right? It's right on Israel's border, and because of this massive arsenal of rockets, missiles, and drones that they had built up over the years, right? The estimates are somewhere between 150 to 200,000 before the Israelis started in on them, right? So between the land border and the ability to attack Israel by land and these missile forces, right? That created the greatest problem for Israel. You're right. Had that come in full scale on October 7, along with the Hamas attack, Israel would have had its hands full. I suspect they still would have won, but it would have been much messier, much bigger fight, much worse for the Israelis. They didn't. And so the remaining threat was still always Hezbollah, but the Israelis got to deal with Hezbollah on their own terms. And I think it's a very important element of why this battle is actually going quite well for Israel in the north, right? Because they're able to take on Hezbollah on their own terms, having dealt with Hamas. And now they can, again, we can talk about what's going on in Gaza, and I'm not trying to suggest that it's somehow a wonderful story, but militarily, the Israelis are now dealing with Gaza at a much reduced level of effort, which is allowing them to focus much more heavily on Hezbollah. And last point I'll make there, that's also one of the reasons why I do not imagine the Israelis are going to want to escalate very significantly against Iran. I think it's also one of the reasons why the Israelis have delayed their response to the October 1 Iranian attack, is they want to focus on Hezbollah right now. What they're doing to Hezbollah is about as good as I think they could have imagined. They don't want to let up the pressure. They don't want to get distracted by Iran, which is one of the things I think the Iranians were trying to do when they launched their own attack on October 1.
I want to get to responses to Iran in a second, but just staying on the Hezbollah-Hamas fight.
Mm-hmm.
How bad is it for Iran in the region, both strategically but also reputationally, that the fight against, Hamas is kind of a different creature, right? But Hezbollah was supposed to really be the ace in the hole for the Iranians. And the fact, between the pager operation and basically just, basically, if you didn't have a pager a month and a half ago, you were getting coffee, and now you're senior management, right? So, how bad does that actually look for Iran, and how fixable is? What are the prospects for restoring Hezbollah a year, 2 years from now, or is it permanently, truly? It's not destroyed, but is it the level of its degradation now to make it? Would you demote it as a military and strategic asset from AAA to junk bond status? How would you rank it now?
Yeah. So both great questions. Let me take each of them in turn. So your first question about how bad this is for Iran, it's really bad, right? You had me on soon after the October 7 attack. I can't remember the exact date, but my memory is at that point in time, I said, look, right now Iran is winning. Right, everything is going Iran's way. The Hamas attack was, a huge surprise. It was not just a tragedy for Israel; it was a real threat.
Right.
Plus, Hezbollah had joined in,
and it blew up the normalization stuff, which was very bad for Israel. Yeah.
Exactly, right. Set back Israel's regional integration in a huge way. Right? All this stuff was terrible for Israel, fantastic for Iran. That has completely flipped now. And, you're right, you're focusing on exactly the critical issue, which is the impact on Hezbollah. What happened to Hamas was really bad for Iran too. But what is now happening to Hezbollah is an order of magnitude worse. Exactly as you pointed out, Hezbollah was the crown jewel of Iran's axis of resistance,
Mm-hmm.
right? They were supposed to be the great fighters. They had fought Israel from 1985 to 2000 and forced the Israelis to leave Lebanon. They had fought in Syria and helped Assad retain power in Syria. They had all of these missiles and drones, and they had given the Israelis fits, right? They were, the best of the best on Iran's side.
And they were also kind of embedded in a real state in a way that Hamas never was, right? I mean,
Oh,
they don't run Lebanon, but they don't not run Lebanon either.
yeah, I'd say they don't not run Lebanon is the even more important piece, right? The only
Yeah.
reason they don't run Lebanon is they don't want to.
Right.
But wherever it matters, they run Lebanon, right? So you're absolutely correct. And in addition to that, really important to understand, to remember, I know you know this because I've heard you say it, Hezbollah was always considered Iran's strategic deterrent,
Mm-hmm.
right? The card that Iran would always play whenever the Israelis threatened, or even sometimes when we threatened Iran, the card that they would wave around is Hezbollah will attack Israel. If Israel attacks us, Hezbollah will attack. If the U.S. attacks us, Hezbollah will attack Israel. And that threat was taken very, very seriously. And I'm not saying it wasn't a serious threat. I think it was. Again, what's important now is that the Israelis are waging this war on their terms. In those circumstances, it probably would have started with Hezbollah getting some free shots at Israel, which probably would have been very painful, might have caused some real damage in Israel's case. But right now, what we're seeing is the demolition of Hezbollah. And as you're pointing out, right, this started with a series of intelligence coups by the Israelis that demonstrated how well the Israelis had completely compromised Hezbollah's operational security. So that was a huge blow to Hezbollah and through Hezbollah to Iran. The Israelis have significantly suppressed Hezbollah's launches, rockets, missiles, drones, etc. The amount of damage Hezbollah has done has been really quite minimal. I mean, again, it's Israel. They're very sensitive to casualties. So, for instance, the drone that was able to sneak through 2 weeks ago and hit an Israeli military mess hall south of Haifa that killed 4 Israelis and wounded dozens more. Right, that's a big deal for Israel. It's, in the grand scheme of this war, it's nothing to set against the balance sheet of what Israel has done to Hezbollah. And what's more, both the Israelis and the U.S. seem to think that Israel has killed about 1,500 Hezbollah fighters, and Hezbollah is a pretty small organization. So those 1,500, that's a meaningful loss. Plus, again, the U.S. and Israel believe that the Israelis have destroyed about half of Hezbollah's rockets, missiles, etc. And again, at one level you can say, well, Hezbollah still has 75 or 100,000. That's true. That's a lot. But the fact that the Israelis have destroyed 75 to 100,000 already with nothing but airstrikes and very limited ground incursions, that's still really remarkable. So this is a huge egg on Iran's face. This is an enormous turn of events, a war that for about 6 months Iran was winning handily, a great achievement. Iran has turned around completely. This is a disaster for Iran. Their crown jewel has been smashed. Their strategic deterrent has been demonstrated to be toothless, right? This is absolutely terrible for the Iranians. And I have to imagine that in Tehran, they are trying desperately to find a way to end this thing without losing too much face. Mm-hmm. Now, your last point of your question, do you want to get to that, which is how fast could Hezbollah reconstitute? And there, unfortunately, the problem is relatively quickly, right? Mm-hmm. If this war were to end today, my best guess is that within 2 or 3 years, you'd probably see Hezbollah in the same shape it was in on October 6, 2023, if not better, because it will, to coin a phrase, build back better, right? Mm-hmm. It will learn from its mistakes. It will have Russian assistance, maybe some Iranian assistance, although it's typically Hezbollah giving more assistance to Hezbollah teaches Iran a lot more than Iran teaches Hezbollah. People have the causal arrows wrong. But, it has that ability to reconstitute. That's why everyone constantly carping on this point about the day after is actually exactly right. right? Because, we know something about these kinds of organizations, right? These malignant organizations. Hezbollah is a giant parasite on the Lebanese body politic. And unless you address that, it will grow back, right? And
Mm-hmm.
as I said, it will grow back worse than it was beforehand. And once again, just as we see in Gaza, nobody has realistic plans for how you deal with Lebanon that would prevent Hezbollah from growing back. Now, the last point I'll make on that is that doesn't mean what Israel is doing is fruitless. Okay, it absolutely does not. After those of your listeners who don't know, so in 2006, Israel and Hezbollah fought what was called the Second Lebanon War. It was something like this, only smaller and more incompetent because the Israelis just didn't know what they were doing at that point in time. And it was coded as a very big win for Hezbollah, right? Most people come away thinking, great win for Hezbollah. And I think politically it was for exactly that reason. Militarily, it was still a very big loss for Hezbollah. They
Mm-hmm.
took a tremendous pounding. And what's really important is after that happened, Hassan Nasrallah, the then leader of Hezbollah, gave an interview in which he said, if I had known how much damage the Israelis were going to do to us, I never would have started it in the first place. And for 17 years thereafter, from 2006 to 2023, Hezbollah was basically quiet.
Yeah.
And that is a big part of what the Israelis are trying to do now, is not just destroy these Hezbollah capabilities in the false belief that they'll never grow back. Again, I think the Israelis expect they probably will, but to inflict so much pain on Hezbollah that it'll be even worse than 2006, and it will convince any Hezbollah leadership we should not do that again. And that hopefully they can get another 17 years or maybe even longer of peace, which, if you're Israel, that's the best you get. Unfortunately, the international community does not allow Israel to come up with a military solution to any of these problems. And so that's what the Israelis get left with, is what they call mowing the lawn. And the question really is, how long can they go before they get attacked again? If they can get another 17 years of peace with Hezbollah, I think they would call that a victory.
So that sort of sets me up perfectly for the next question. But I will say, I don't like being ghoulish about people being maimed and deformed and all that kind of stuff. But if the issue is deterrence, there's going to be a whole generation of Hezbollah people who are missing hands, right? Or missing eyes. And that's a better reminder than some forgotten. I mean, it wasn't the point of the thing. I'm not trying to make it sound like the Israelis were that fiendish. But seeing those people around for a long time is a better reminder than some forgotten martyr that, the next generation just hears about. Right. And, you could see how the deterrent effect of that is probably an unintended consequence. But when you say all the Israelis get is basically a respite, right? Is a reprieve from fighting for a while, kind of thing. There is a lot of talk, particularly in Israel, about how this needs to be "quote unquote" the last war, right? That we need to sort of Michael Corleone on the day of his niece's christening is going to settle all family business, and that seems to me. I would like that to be true as someone who takes Israel's side on these things and thinks it has I am the mirror universe image of Ta-Nehisi Coates on these things. But that sounds awfully utopian for Israel, right? You were sort of already answered it can't be the last war because the facts on the ground kind of thing. But where do you come down on how this talk about going all the way and taking out Iran's nuclear program? People keep. We did a special dispatch October 7th anniversary episode where a bunch of people were talking about what a squish I am on all of this, because I was like, I want to be persuaded it can work, and if it can work, let's talk about it. I'm down, yay. But if it can't work, I mean, even though I take your points and you're correct of, very seriously about how an all quote unquote all out war would not look that different than what we're seeing right now, just sort of, amplified version of right now. Trying to take out Iran's nuclear program and not succeeding feels like a very bad idea. And feels like it's not possible without the help of America, which does not seem interested in doing that. There are other people who say that's not really true and that they could do it on their own. I'm skeptical. How do you see it?
Sure. So a lot of good stuff in there, Jonah. Let me start just very quickly with where you start out, which is, yes, this needs to be the last war. Good luck. I mean, again, that requires a political settlement. And again, as you're already pointing out, it requires a political settlement, including some very significant, really big efforts on the part of countries other than Israel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which no one seems willing to make. And again, we can talk about that if you'd like to, but that's the only way you get there, unless the international community is suddenly going to allow the Israelis to impose an actual military solution, a strategic military solution, which again, I think is exceptionally unlikely. Now let's talk about the Iranian nuclear program. So a few things that are worth understanding about the Iranian nuclear program and an Israeli strike on it. And again, I'm always struck by how really smart people do not get the most important elements of it. First, there's the Osirak myth, right? Everyone on the face of the planet seems to believe that in 1981, a small force of Israeli warplanes bombed the Iraqi nuclear reactor at Tuwaitha. It was called the Osirak reactor. It was a French reactor that was built for the Iraqis. The Israelis bombed it, and everyone believes that set back the Iraqi nuclear program, and that's why we didn't have an Iraqi nuclear weapon when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. And that is absolutely false. Absolutely false. It's what we believed for the longest time. But after we invaded Iraq and got our hands on all of Iraq's nuclear materials and were able to interview all of their scientists, what we learned that the exact opposite is what happened. That the Iraqi nuclear program was there. Saddam always wanted a nuclear weapon, but it was incompetent and small and not particularly well funded until the Osirak strike, which was so infuriating to Saddam that he began pouring resources into the Iraqi nuclear program. And so the Iraqi nuclear program makes its greatest strides after the Osirak strike. And the question is not, or the relief, I guess, is not that, thank God for the Osirak strike, because that prevented Iraq from having a nuclear weapon when Saddam invaded Kuwait. It's the opposite. It's thank God Saddam was stupid enough to invade Kuwait before he had a nuclear weapon, because he was actually really close to having one. And again, there are different estimates. The IAEA believed that the Iraqis were 6 to 24 months from having a nuclear weapon at the time of the Gulf War. The Iraqi scientists thought that they probably could get one by 93 to 95, right? It depends on which scientists you talk to, right? But this is the point, is the Osirak strike does not set back the Iraqi nuclear program. It massively accelerates it. Okay, This is the great danger with an Israeli strike against the Iranian nuclear program. Frankly, it's the same danger with a U.S. strike against the Iranian nuclear program, which is not how much of it are we going to get, or how long could we set it back. Even if we went in, because of all the knowledge that the Iranians have at this point in time, right, and basically their ability to reconstitute, I think the best estimates are that even a brilliant strike by the U.S. and Israel together, or just by the U.S., because frankly, we don't need the Israelis if we're going to do it, might set the Iranians back by 2 or 3 years. But the problem is that the most likely Iranian response to that strike is to stand up from the rubble, dust themselves off, announce that they are withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and they will be building a nuclear arsenal. And they will start building underground facilities all across the country, deep inside mountains where it's very hard to get to them. Like they've already got this place called Ferdo, and they're building another outside of Natanz, right? They'd build them all across the country. We would not have any inspectors to know where they're. The inspectors, the most important source of intelligence we have on the Iranian nuclear program. And so even the most successful strike against the Iranian nuclear program, way beyond what the Israelis could do, right? The most successful strike might set them back by 2 or 3 years, but could easily guarantee that Israel faces a nuclear Iran at some point soon after that. And that is a huge net negative for Israel, right? Iran right now is a nuclear threshold state. They could acquire nuclear weapons pretty soon if they wanted to, right? And we can argue about how much. It's probably a matter of months, not weeks, but nonetheless, they could probably acquire nuclear weapons in a matter of months if they ever chose to do so. And that's very different from Iran having no nuclear program. But the difference between Iran being a threshold nuclear state and having an actual nuclear arsenal is, again, orders of magnitude worse. For Israel, for Saudi Arabia, for all of our allies in the region. We do not want Iran to have an actual extant nuclear arsenal. And that is the great danger of trying to strike Iran's nuclear program, is that it could move the Iranians from being a threshold state to being an actual nuclear weapon state. That would constitute an existential threat to Israel in a way that they currently are not.
Okay, so you're a foreign policy muckety muck, and you go to conferences at hotels with clever cheese and fancy tables and all that kind of stuff. And I am sure you've been on some panel with an Israeli military or ex-military guy, a John Bolton American type person, whoever. What do they say to this argument? Because I don't know what I don't know on this, right? But like, as you say, a lot of smart people I know who I disagreed with for my own sort of prudential reasons, sort of instinctual reasons, kind of push back against and saying, I want to know how it would work. But there are a lot of people who follow this stuff for a living who think it would work. So what is it that they say in response over, clever cheese and dried fruit at one of these Stad conferences that you go to, in response to this?
So the people who are not quite as smart as they think they are simply just try to dismiss it.
Uh-huh.
Right? But the much more interesting response is the truly smart people that I talk about this with. And I will give you the response that I got from a former very senior Israeli official who I had, because what you'll often get is you get this initial, we could blow it up, you should join us, and then I come back with this, and it's kind of, they realize, oh, this guy actually understands the problem really, so I now have to have a different conversation. And what this Israeli, very senior official said was, this is why it can't be our problem. This is why Iran cannot be Israel's problem, because we don't have the ability to deal with it. Don't make it our problem. Only the United States can deal with the Iran problem. And what he was saying to me was, yes, again, we've unpacked this, and I've had this conversation with any number of other, really bright Israelis who understand the realities here. At the end of the day, the military option is a very useful threat, because there's no question the Iranians don't want to get bombed. And it's also a plan B or plan C, right? So if at some point the Iranians were to just decide, yeah, we're going to build a bomb, then the U.S. and Israel, at least Israel, hopefully the U.S. as well, would strike the nuclear facilities to try to stave it off, right? Try to buy those 2 or 3 years of delay that I talked about. Because, as a former U.S. Policymaker, in political terms, 2 or 3 years, it's a lot of time. All kinds of things. You, I'm sure, know the famous joke about the 2 thieves, who steal from the king, and then they're brought before the king, and they're ordered to be executed, and the king, says off with their heads, and they're about to be taken out. One of the thieves suddenly says, Your Highness, please don't kill us. If you don't kill us, we can do something amazing for you. We know how to turn your horses, your beloved horses,
manure.
Manure, thank you. It's gold. And the king says, you can? He says, yes, yes, just give us a year, and I promise you, we will turn all of your horses' manure into gold. And the king says, okay, that's worth it. Locks them up in a tower for, a year, says, if you can, a year's time, either you turn all my horses' manure into gold or I execute you. And so they're in the tower with food and, hay for the horse, and the second thief turns to the first one and says, what the hell were you doing? We can't turn the horse's manure into gold. And the first thief says to him, relax, I bought us a year, right? And who knows what could happen in a year? In a
Right.
year, the king could die, the horse could die, we could die, or maybe we'll turn the horse's manure into gold, right?
Okay.
So, if the Iranians were about to dash for a nuclear weapon, under those circumstances, I do think the Israelis would strike. I think there's some reasonable chance that the United States might also join in to try to buy that time and hope that you could do something else during that period of time to prevent the Iranians from going ahead and building a full-scale nuclear arsenal. But that's really the utility of the threat to strike, right? It's the Iranians don't want to go down this path, and it's a very useful plan B. But the real solution, the plan A, has to be a diplomatic solution. Right? It's why, while I didn't love the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal that Obama signed in 2015, I thought I think I've said this on the Remnant, and it barely cleared the bar, right? It's like the pole vaulter whose butt scrapes the bar as he's going over it, but it did clear it. It was a useful agreement if we had handled it differently, and in particular, if we'd had different Iran policies on the part of Obama and Trump. I think that we could have made it work, because at the end of the day, that is the only way to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon until there is regime change in Tehran, right? And that ultimately has got to be, a very important element too. Not in the immediate term, over the long term, we've got to recognize this is a regime in Tehran that, is our enemy, not because we want it to be, but because they have declared themselves to be. And they do it repeatedly, no matter how hard we try to be their friend, right? And it's a regime that is hated by its people. So there is every reason to believe that it will not survive forever. But this is the problem with the Iranian nuclear program. The military strikes, they are useful as a threat. They are useful as a last-ditch contingency. They are not the optimal solution to the problem. Not now, not a year ago, probably not a year from now.
Okay, I have a clarification question that might be stupid, but is the nuclear program, is Iran's nuclear program like a plane that is going towards its destination at half speed? Or is it like a plane that is basically at its destination and just circling the airport, right? Is the thing that has prevented Iran from getting a nuclear weapon that it just hasn't decided to assemble the last bits and say, okay, now we have one? Or is it that they're still working on stuff? Because the way people talk about it, we have to, they keep saying they're only X months from having this, or a year from having it, or whatever. And yet implicit in your position is that it's the thing that holding it back from having a nuclear weapon sooner is will. And also, I would have to think at this point, given Iran's relationship with Russia would give it the know-how to do, if it's missing know-how, right? Like that's got to be available to Iran if they really want it, in exchange for whatever aid Russia would want. So what is it? Are they tapping the brakes, or are they just not hitting the gas as hard as they could?
Yeah, so this is a big question in my community, and there's a debate, right? There are some people who are suggesting it is more like your first analogy of the plane that's moving at half speed to it. But I think increasingly the consensus is that it's circling, right? That ultimately it is the absence of a political decision to go ahead and do what they need to. they've got the fissile material, right? It's simply a matter of enriching that, and we know that they know how to enrich it. The other half is the weapon itself, and there are people who will say, well, there's still a bunch of stuff that they would need to do for the weapon that they haven't done yet. But again, when you kind of scratch them, what they'll say is they could do it. It's pretty straightforward. They almost certainly do have the know-how. Remember, they were being helped by AQ Khan, the Pakistani, who was helping everybody build nuclear weapons. And I think that you're right. There are a lot of people who also assume that the Russians would be willing to give them this assistance, because at this point, Putin's basically willing to sell his grandmother to get help in Ukraine, which the Iranians are doing, which is why it really is much more the latter.
And
right?
also,
It's
North
like,
Korea is willing to exchange goods for services and all that, right?
But even the folks who do say that they've still got some to do will say, at the end of the day, this is a matter of political will. And what we've seen very consistently from Ayatollah Khamenei, who's the supreme leader of Iran, the guy who actually calls the shots, is that since the Obama administration, he's basically decided that he doesn't need a nuclear weapon, right? He wants to be on the cusp of having one, a nuclear threshold state, and then it's very useful to him to use his nuclear program to try to get stuff from us, primarily sanctions relief, right? And that's what the deal, the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, was really about. It was, formalizing that. But as part of that, that was Khamenei saying, yeah, you free up my economy and I'll put my nuclear program more or less on ice, more or less permanently, right, for as long as this thing lasts. And that's what Donald Trump foolishly tore up, not understanding what he was actually doing, right? But this is the fundamental problem. The issue here is about political will, right? It is that the Iranians have not chosen to go ahead and build these weapons because everyone believes that they could do so. The only debate is, would it take them a few months, a year, but it's within that range. And the issue is the political will.
I want to switch to America. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you what you think is going to happen in crucial Waukesha County or anything like that. But how the Biden administration has responded to Israel and the wider regional tensions. One could, if one were purely like a press spokesperson or a PR person, one could cherry pick the narrative and say, and really tell a story of forceful leadership, staunch support of Israel, get some good sound bites from some speeches, right? Or if one were, let's say, more critical of the Biden administration, heaven forfend anyone in this conversation be something like that, one could paint a very, very damning picture of vacillation, indecision, undercutting, political, I don't want to say corruption in terms of like money corruption, but like the corruption of partisan politics and essentially primary internal democratic politics. What is your assessment? I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that sounds really good, or at least people are saying it sounds really good. And then you see a kind of certain zigzag quality to things that makes it hard to figure out what. It's not that the pudding has no theme; it's hard to figure out what the theme to the pudding is.
Yeah.
So, what is your take on all of it?
Yeah. So I actually think you've put it really nicely, Jonah. I think that there has been, quite a bit of good in Biden's handling of Israel, but it's hardly been perfect. And I think that the zigzags, the vacillations, right, they've actually been quite costly. I was in the White House under President Clinton. I was seconded from various agencies. I was not a political appointee, but I thought that President Clinton actually handled Israel extremely well. He was the guy who really cracked the code. And I think early on, Biden recognized that, right? And he was following the Clinton playbook early on. And the Clinton playbook was, if you want to move the Israelis, you have to hug them really tight. You have to give them everything that they really need on almost every issue out there, you need to prioritize what you want from the Israelis, and then you need to focus like a laser on getting that from them. Right? And early on, I think that Biden was trying to do that. The problem was, and it's because
and what was he trying to get from them?
so I think early on, what he was trying to get from them was the day after, which I think is exactly right. Right? I think that they recognized that Israel had suffered this absolutely horrendous terrorist attack. Right? It did feel to the Israelis very much like what we felt on 9/11. That the Israelis had every right to defend themselves. That Hamas was nothing but a nihilistic terrorist organization looking to destroy the state of Israel, right? If anybody's genocidal here, it is Hamas, right? And Israel needed to have the right to defend itself, but the key was going to be the political situation in Gaza afterwards, right? That this is what was necessary for the long-term good of the entire Middle East, of the Israelis, of the Palestinians, of everyone. And I think that was exactly right. The problem was, and I think you were getting at it in a number of the points that you're making. And again, as a constant Remnant listener, I know that this is something that you were very focused on. I think rightly so, which is that Biden came off that approach way too quickly, right? That when there started to be these political blips on the map, right? And I know you've had guests who are much more expert than I am to come on and talked about Michigan and what happened in the Michigan primary, right? But the administration kind of panicked about that in ways that your guests suggested they had no business doing so. And I'm not going to comment on that. I will simply say that, this desire to try to buy off 100,000 people in Michigan came at the cost of taking their eye off this laser-like focus that they needed to keep on the day after, right? And so they began to criticize the Israelis and threaten to withhold aid, and we did, looks like, withhold certain forms of aid to the Israelis, and that started to squander all of the political capital that Biden was building up to try to use for the day after, which is the most important thing by far, as it for everyone, starting with the United States of America. And that's what I continue to see is, on the one hand, they do great stuff with the Israelis. On the other hand, they then undermine themselves by, going after this small potatoes stuff and not staying focused on the really big picture stuff. Last point I want to make about this, because again, it's very much related to what you're getting at. There does seem to be, and again, I think a big issue of this is the administration keeps listening to its critics, listening to the press, right? You read the press, reading the New York Times earlier, right? You would think that America's great interest in all of this is simply stopping the wars, right? No escalation, no more people dying. I would actually argue that the worst thing for the United States is if America's allies lose this war, right? That is the worst thing for the United States by far. Because if you want to have more wars, go ahead and let the Israelis come away with a loss. Right? Nothing will embolden Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iranians, right? And let's, remember, again, these people are looking to destroy the state of Israel. They are looking to commit genocide. They are also looking to undermine, overthrow, destroy all of America's other allies in the region. They don't have any love for the Saudi government. They don't have any love for the Jordanian government, the Emirati government. They're looking to overthrow or subjugate all of these different governments. And if Israel comes out of this with anything other than a clear win, you are going to embolden all of them. Right? And I think that, again, this speaks to the fact that the Biden administration does not have a clear understanding of what America's interests in this war are. Right? This is a war between the purveyors of violence in the Middle East. That is who the Iranians lead. Theirs is an alliance of people who are looking to use violence to rearrange the status quo to suit their needs, right? On the other side, and again, I'm not suggesting that our allies are somehow perfect. They're not. But all of them are ultimately status quo powers who are looking for change peacefully. Right? The Saudis, again, MBS is not a perfect person, but he is looking to reform Saudi Arabia. And he's actually made a lot of changes there, many of which Saudis will tell you have been incredibly positive. Right.
Hmm.
And again, I would look at that and say what the US should be doing is helping MBS with those reforms to make them even better in Saudi Arabia. So it is a peaceful vision of change as opposed to a violent vision of change. And I don't think that the administration gets that. They're letting, again, these different domestic political considerations, right, their fear of losing any votes anywhere, get in the way of a clear-eyed assessment of, okay, what would be best for the United States of America in terms of the outcome of this war. From my perspective, there is no question. We want the Israelis to win this war because that will say to the purveyors of violence that the root of war is not going to work. And by the way, for those who might despair, oh, this will never happen, this has happened. Right? So before basically 1973, all of the Arab states believed that there was a military solution to their problem with Israel. Right? That's why they attacked in 1948. That is why they were building up in 1967. That is why they attacked again in 1973. And it was the fact that Israel kept winning those wars in 48, 56, 67, 73. All of it convinced all of the Arab leaders, with the exceptions of Muammar Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, that they didn't have a military option against Israel. Right? And they stopped attacking Israel. And that's what led Anwar Sadat. And Sadat already knew this before the 73 war. Sadat was actually a very wise man. Right? He, made peace with Israel first, and then the Jordanians do. And, the Assads never went to war with Israel again. Right? In 82, it's the Israelis who picked that fight. So it is absolutely possible to convince these groups that there is no military solution to their problems with Israel. You're going to have to follow a peaceful route. It's not a hopeless cause.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned this because when you read, I remember doing a deep dive post October 7th on what Hamas's real strategic goal here was, what they were telling like American-based pro-Hamas, anti-Israel groups and all that. And the key point for a lot of them was dispelling the myth of Zionist permanence, right? It's this whole idea that it's actually a weak facade. And if you can demonstrate that, you will arouse the will, sort of a strong horse argument, right? If you can prove, oh, behold the God that bleeds, that Israel is not this, permanent fixture on the map, that creates a catalytic effect for popular will to make that self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And that was sort of to prove it has a glass jaw on October 7th, and which is why we should be glad that Israel has responded the way it did. But getting back to I just wrote my LA Times column about this thing I'm obsessed with. Yuval Levin and I, take turns banging our spoons on our high chairs about the problems that you get with domestic politics when you have basically a national tie, right? Sidney Lubbels, this guy who came up with this theory of the sun and moon party. Majority parties are a sun party, and minority parties are a moon party, and they'll trade places, but like policies done within the sun party kind of thing. And now we have basically for the last 25 years, 2 moon parties. Anyway, what hadn't really occurred to me until I was listening to you talk is its effect on foreign policy. Insofar as if you have a large coalition, it gives you the room, domestic coalition, right? It gives you the room to maneuver, to sort of screw one interested party for the benefit of national security or national interest. Insofar as I always point out how the FDR coalition was so friggin' big, it had communist Jews and Klansmen in it, right? I mean, it was a big coalition, and that gives you when no member of the coalition can threaten to destroy the coalition. So, like, why Israeli politics are so stupid, right? Is that each little tiny micro party, the no mayo on pastrami party, is capable of bringing down the government, which means you got to sort of placate them. When you think your hold on power in the United States is contingent on Muslim and Arab voters in Michigan or Jewish voters in the Philly suburbs. I'm not trying to make a point about one having a stranglehold or the other and anything like that. But it's sort of like when I do the punditry stuff, I just did this again last night, and people are asking, you know, who's going to win and why and all that kind of stuff. The analogy I keep using is like, those game shows where you're supposed to have a shopping cart and you're supposed to like fill exactly $300 and you can't go over. If you go $1 over, you can say, okay, the last thing you put in the cart was the thing that made you over. Or you can say the first thing that you put in the cart made you over, right? Was it the beef jerky? Was it the urinal mint? It doesn't really matter. Like, they all put you over in the aggregate. And so when you have this kind of politics, where you're constantly looking, am I going to remove the Jenga piece from my coalition that costs me or my party power? It creates the kind of incoherence that you hear from Biden on this stuff, because he's constantly trying to nudge back in whatever Jenga piece he's afraid of losing.
Yeah. So I think that's a fabulous point. And, first, as you point out, pointy-headed foreign policy types like me are constantly trying to get domestic politics out of foreign policy for exactly this reason. Domestic politics rarely lends itself to good foreign policy making. And, I don't want to completely despair. I think there have been times when we've been able to more or less set domestic political considerations aside and just concentrate on the foreign policy issues. Even recently, not that long ago, certainly within your lifetime and mine, right? As far as I'm concerned, I think that George H.W. Bush did that extremely well.
He did.
With the first Persian Gulf War, right? In particular.
And the unification of Germany. I mean, there were a bunch of things he did really well.
It's all, I completely agree with you on that. But it's very hard, right? And the simple fact is, again, pointy-headed foreign policy types like me may rail against it, but it's like trying to, scream into the wind, right? It ain't going to work. At the end of the day, domestic politics is critical, and I'll be the first to invoke Tip O'Neill here, that all politics is local, so it is inevitable. But at the very least, we do need to recognize that we often wind up paying costs, right? I just finished writing the manuscript for my latest book, this enormous history of the U.S. and Iraq, right? And that's one of my points, is that, unfortunately, Iraq became bound up with our domestic politics at a time when we were becoming increasingly polarized. That polarized the debate over Iraq in an incredibly unhelpful way. And then it fed back into it, right? Because all the bad things that happened as a result of Iraq then got fed back into our domestic politics and made the polarization even worse. Right. The last thing I do want to say on that, I think it's just kind of an interesting question, in particular for folks more like you than me. There was a time, and I worry that it is now past, that's why I'm making exactly this point, where a president could use the bully pulpit and make a case for a foreign policy action and get a lot of support, even from the other party for it, right? So when you look at many American decisions, in particular to go to war, you will often see, better than half the country, even 60, 70%, sometimes high 70s of the American public saying, yes, we're ready to follow the president on this, because in these cases were all men. He is the president. We trust him on this. I worry that our polarization is getting so intense that exactly the issue that you and I are now talking about, how domestic politics is becoming an even ever greater force, and even these, relatively minor domestic political issues are now looming large and having a disproportionate impact on foreign policy issues, that we may be losing that, and that it may be harder and harder for a president to simply appeal to, the American people as the American people and say, I believe that we need to do this. It is what is best for the country. I'm afraid that increasingly people are just going to look at that and say, he's a Democrat, so he's just doing that for the Democratic Party, or she's a Republican, she's just doing it for the good of the Republican Party. If that's the case, that would be a terrible trend for our country.
Yeah, I don't dispute in the slightest that that's a trend, and it's a disturbing one. I think it's exacerbated by the fact that Joe Biden, because of his age, and Donald Trump, because of his Donald Trumpness, are sort of uniquely incapable in their own ways of being effective communicators. Like, I was a big Obama critic in all sorts of ways. He was an effective communicator. even George W. Bush, when he was reading from a prompter, right, he was an effective communicator. Not as good as Obama, not as glib as a natural. And Bill Clinton was like the best of my lifetime, with the possible exception of Reagan. And so I think it's just hard to disentangle how much of the partisan polarization and how much of our uniquely bad luck with our political leadership that we've had plays into it. Do you have time to hang out for just a couple more minutes? Because a couple of other. Okay. So first of all, for all I know, you're part of the same Bohemian Grove camp, or something like that, as Robert Malley. But what the hell is going on there? Can you explain it for a normal person who only hears bits and pieces, and like where it is now?
So with regard to Rob's suspension from government, is that it?
Yeah, I mean, like, he's been accused, or it's been insinuated that he has given. I want to do this as a 1-2 thing, because I also want to ask you about this leak. And I know they're not the same thing, but they are in the same solar system in terms of concerns about the administration and whatnot. But Robert Malley was like the Iran envoy. There is the allegation that he shared information that he should not have shared. And he has been on leave for a remarkably long period of time. Is my understanding. But like,
Right.
Can you put flesh on the bones about like how to think about this? What you know?
I'll answer the question as best I can, Jonah, but I do need to start with some caveats. So, Rob's a friend of mine, right?
Yeah.
So let me give you an answer, and you guys decide whether or not you want to keep it in or not.
Okay. All right. Okay. And you can think about it too for a little bit. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So, I'll put it this way. Rob believes very strongly that the United States needs to be talking to everyone, right? Not just its allies, but also its enemies. That this is the only way that you're going to overcome differences, is to have these kinds of conversations. As you pointed out, he was our Iran envoy. He got quite close to a number of different Iranians as a result of that. And my sense, at least, is that he felt like there were avenues that were worth pursuing, that there were elements within the Iranian government who were more receptive to improving relations with the United States, and that he believed that it was very important that the United States go ahead and pursue them. And I don't know the specifics of his case. I absolutely don't. And if Rob did something that he should not have, as his friend, I will say I think that's a shame, but he also shouldn't have done that. I simply don't know.
Okay.
But my sense is that that's really what the case is about, that he apparently said or did something that other elements of the U.S. government decided were inappropriate. And that they're pursuing those leads, and we will see what happens. But that's my sense of Rob's motives, both from having known him for a long time, and also other things that I've heard from him and other people, related to just how he was approaching Iran, and therefore related to this specific incident.
Okay, that's helpful. Now, this leak that there was apparently some sort of list of options or battle plan kind of thing, or proposed battle plan against Iran, retaliation plan, and is some sort of document that the Israelis gave to Americans at some level of government, and it ends up on Telegram. And our friends at the Commentary Podcast were not saying that the most likely by any stretch, but they're saying a possible explanation of this, that this actually could be a clever attempt by Israel to flesh out where the leaks are, because they've been complaining about a lot of leaks. But the more likely thing is that there's somebody inside the State Department or the Defense Department or somewhere who is more on the anti-Israel side, and they put it out there. How big a deal is it, and what do you think is going on there?
Yeah, so first, I think, either of those explanations are valid. I think there's also some possibility that the Israelis wanted this leaked as a form of misinformation, misdirection for the Iranians. I think all that's possible. But I agree with you, Jonah, that I think the most likely explanation is that this is someone who is opposed to Israel or opposed to an Israeli strike and is actually trying to head it off. And by putting this stuff out there, is throwing a monkey wrench into the works, and who also may be looking to try to just sour the relationship between the United States and Israel, right? If Israel believes that it can't tell the United States what it's up to, or it can't allow the United States to see what it's doing, right? Because some of that leak clearly was readouts of our satellite imagery, our photographic imagery analysis of Israeli military operations, and then what our intelligence analysts were concluding that it suggested about Israeli strike operations. So again, it's the kind of thing which could incline the Israelis to say, we can't trust the Americans, right? And therefore we need to hide what we're doing from the Americans, which will inevitably piss off the United States, make us, somewhat more confrontational with them. I think all of that's possible. Again, I think that the most likely explanation is that this is someone who is not happy about an Israeli strike or not happy about the U.S.-Israel relationship. How much it's going to affect things is ultimately hard to know, because we don't know what the actual Israeli plan is or was. We don't know to what extent the Israelis believe that what is now out there has tipped off the Iranians enough to enable them to prevent the Israelis from doing what they were planning to do. And we also don't know how easy it would be for the Israelis to shift to alternative plans, right, to contingencies. It may very well be that the Israelis look at this and say, all right, well, that sucks. We were planning to do this. The Iranians may have figured out that that's what we're planning to do. So we'll just go do this, right? Another target, just as easy. We can do that. Or it may be that, the Iranians are going to see something in there, maybe about the strike route itself, right, that might cause them to say, wow, we got to, completely throw that out the window, start again from scratch. We just do not know. I think it is safe to say this wasn't helpful, right? This was not helpful to Israel. It was not helpful to the U.S.-Israel relationship. Right? And, again, my perspective, at the end of the day, even folks who have sympathy for the Palestinians, and I have tremendous sympathy for the Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
I continue to believe that a two-state solution is the only viable solution to this circumstances. I desperately want to see the Palestinians have that state, be in control of their destiny, have a good government that actually delivers to their people the goods and services that they definitely deserve, right? It screws even that, right? It undermines even that. It makes it harder for the United States to move Israel to again, great Bill Clinton line. He used to talk about, we need to help the Israelis take risks for peace.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It was a brilliant statement. He's absolutely right. Because when the Israelis are afraid, they're not interested in taking risks for peace, because peace entails risk for the Israelis. Right. And you have to recognize that. And the Israelis are strong enough, as they are demonstrating, that if they don't want to take risks, they don't have to. Right. And they can just kind of, get into a defensive crouch, turtle themselves up, ultimately to their disadvantage, but even more so to the Palestinians, right, who do not get any progress from it. So if you're looking for progress for the Palestinians, if you are looking for better lives for the Palestinians, this does not help at all. It actually sets back all of those causes.
Yeah, I mean, this is I wrote my LA Times column a couple of weeks ago about the Ta-Nehisi Coates stuff, and his position is that he's against, his line is like, he's against complexity. He thinks this thing is very simple, and the Palestinians are the good guys and the Israelis are the bad guys, and complexity is a problem. And my point is like, complexity is the only friend only hope the Palestinians have. Because if you present this as a black or white thing to the Israelis and say it's zero sum, either they win or you win, they're not going to choose suicide. They're going to choose winning. And the two-state solution is complex. It's difficult. And this idea that, like, saying, okay, this is just simply a black and white story where Israel's facing a group that, as you said before, is genocidal, is like explicitly genocidal in its documents, in its speeches, in its rhetoric. And you say, there's no room for nuance. There's no room for argument about sort of picking non-terrorists apart from actual terrorists and thinking about civilian casualties. If you take out any concern about complexity and just say it's a simple, we win or they win, that is basically, you are an enemy of the Palestinians, which is where I think Coates kind of, in his heart, I don't think he is, but I think the argument that he's putting forward is very bad for Palestinians. And it is amazing the degree to which the people who say, the cognitive dissonance of the crowd that says they're for it, that when you ask them and you say, are you for a two-state solution? They say yes. And do you think Hamas is justified? And they say yes. And it's like, Hamas does not want a two-state solution. And it is a very weird sort of thing. Anyway, I'm sorry for ranting.
No. I agree violently with every single point you've just made, Jonah. And yes, one of the banes of my existence is people saying, look, it's simple, right? Mm-hmm. Because in the Middle East, nothing is simple. Anyone who starts by saying it's simple about something related to the Middle East should then be like, I don't know, struck by a lightning bolt to prevent them from continuing that sentence. It's one of the reasons why I am not on Twitter or X or whatever it's called, because there is literally nothing that I can say that would be helpful about the Middle East in 240 characters.
Yeah.
Right? You just cannot do it. The Middle East is nothing but complexity. And, again, if you want to look at the people who have actually, done the mitzvahs, who have actually helped the Middle East, who have brought greater peace and prosperity and, constructive pathways forward, whether it's Anwar Sadat or Yitzhak Rabin or any number of other people, these were people who dealt in nothing but complexity. I teach grand strategy, and when I teach Anwar Sadat's grand strategy, right, I always say to my students, Anwar Sadat's grand strategy for the 1973 October War was the geostrategic equivalent of the triple bank shot off the pool shade or off the lampshade, right? And he did it, right? He actually pulled it off. He made it work. Absolutely unbelievable. That is why we have peace between Israel and Egypt, right? That's what it requires. And yes, anyone who starts out by saying, look, it's simple. I just believe X, or we should do, I can remember, long before Donald Trump said, I can remember, you and I grew up in the same place. Mm-hmm. I can remember, very successful Wall Street types saying to me, look, it's just simple. We should just take the oil.
Right.
And it's like, oh my God. So yeah. Terrible.
All right. Since you are more than just Middle East guy, you also do international foreign policy stuff. I know it's not your specialty, but I'm very cross. I'm more anti-UN than you are. And I don't know actually what your position on the UN is. I just know there's no way that you're more anti-UN than I am. And the fact that Guterres, the UN General Secretary, is going to this conference in Russia, I think it's sort of BRICS plus whatever, right? Is one of the most appalling acts by the UN in memory, right? I mean, yeah, UNRWA is really bad in Gaza, and we can talk about that, but we don't have time to get into that, and people know that. But it is, you have a member of the Security Council that is flagrantly violating both the spirit and the letter of the law of the UN Charter, of international law. It's committing war crimes. It's even violating some chemical weapon things. It's certainly guilty of attempted cultural genocide, and we can talk about whether we could get rid of the word cultural or not. And to go put the imprimatur of the UN on a country that the good guys, and I have no problem using that phrase, have been trying to isolate ever since it invaded Ukraine, is appalling to me. Convince me I shouldn't be appalled.
I can't, Jonah. I will agree with the first point that you made, which is I probably have a slightly higher regard from the UN than you do, just because I have seen it do some good things, or I'll put it differently. I've seen it employed to do certain things. And I think that's an important aspect of it is, we need to recognize that at the end of the day, the United Nations is not a government of its own. The United Nations is not an independent actor, not really. It is ultimately a tool of the nations of the world. And there have been times when the nations of the world have employed that tool somewhat more beneficially. Unfortunately, that's been a rarity. Right.
Yeah.
And far too often it has been employed badly. And whenever it has just been allowed to kind of do its thing, right? It's like, you set the Roomba to high and just let it bounce all around the room, right? It typically does not do very well. And I do think that we need to recognize that the United Nations is not in and of itself a solution to our problems. And I think that, yes, Guterres's actions on a whole variety of different things simply makes that clear. And so thinking that, as Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt did back when they basically invented the idea that somehow this was going to solve our problems, that's just not true. It's not the case. As it can be an instrument, and there have been times when we've been able to use it better, but it's a very imperfect instrument at best. And that's all it is. And yeah, I think that, it is important to call out Guterres on this. I would simply say, I think that it is better done in sorrow rather than in anger, right? Simply just another incident of the United Nations disappointing, right? Of failing to live up to the high standards and values that were once set for it, which, to the extent that it can live up to those, is actually a positive thing in the world.
Yeah, I guess the difference between our visions is that you, in sorrow, see it failing to live up to our expectations, and I get enraged by it because it's living down to my expectations. All right. Ken Pollack, thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate it. Only like 12 or 13 days to go until the election, where everything will just get worse. So, and of course we will have you back on no matter what when your big Iraq book comes out, but no doubt sooner. So
outstanding, Jonah. It's always such a pleasure to join you. Thanks so much for having me.